All right. Hello, how are you? Welcome. We're going to talk today about dev containers. So if you have any questions, please feel free to post in the chat. If you cannot post in the chat is currently limited to subscribers, and you have to be subscribed for 5 minutes before you can engage. So, as usual, this webinar is being recorded. If you want the links that happen to be talked about throughout the presentation, please sign up. The description includes a link as to where you can sign up to get that email. You hear me call it the thank you email. So let's get started. We're going to go into dev containers. All right. So let's talk about dev containers and what they are. All right, so with regards to dev containers, today we're going to talk about how dev containers has made my life easier. In case you don't know, I do work in multiple languages from day to day. So I work in C#, I work with Python and Ruby, PHP and Java, and yes, I also have to work with NodeJS on some projects as well. Being a developer with that many different languages under my belt, and that many languages that I have to deal with on my machine, will get kind of gross. And the dependencies that are attached to those different languages and the different versions of the different languages, now you start to see the layers of complexity. And that makes it even harder, especially when I'm dealing with either multiple versions of C# or multiple versions of Node. That's where my headache is. And so I was looking at dev containers, mostly because I have a background. I've worked with virtualization things since the late 90s. And when I saw Docker, I was like, this makes all sorts of sense. And then dev container showed up, and I'm like, I can Dockerize my development environment, and I don't have to have all this stuff installed on my machine bare metal. This is going to be great. And so once I saw a presentation, I have to give it a shout out to my friend Chris Ayers. He does these talks at conferences throughout the world. And one of his presentations I caught was at Tech Bash 2023. And so when he was talking about dev containers, I was like, this is going to save me a ton of time. And it has. This year I ended up picking up a Ruby project. I have a couple Node.js projects I juggle for work. I juggle some C# projects as well in different versions. So, but like I said, it's a problem because, especially with Node and C#, different versions for different projects. No two projects want the same version, which is frustrating. So yeah, I deal with multiple projects and multiple versions, and the headache is actually having multiple versions right on the base operating system. And this has been a headache for most of my career. It's one of those where it's like, okay, I have my PHP stuff, which is server side does its own thing fine. I have some C# stuff. Well, .NET Framework at the time, fine. Now we have .NET Framework and .NET Core, and so trying to juggle both of those. We're trying to migrate folks from .NET Framework in .NET 6 to .NET 8 and .NET 9. Migrations are something I happen to be a part of a lot. And then with Node. So I have at least 2 Gatsby blogs on 2 different versions of Node. You'll see me blog about this in the Nimble Pros blog. And so the part of those adventures are here in this presentation as well. But again, that emoji there with the swirly eyes and the face, that's how I feel when I have to multiply all these things together. Like, oh, how does this all work? And managing versions is chaotic. When I think about it, first let's think about Node.js. Well, there's NVM, which on a Windows machine, that's what I'm using, and it works just fine. But that's not the only version manager. I could use N. I could use Fast Node Manager. I could use ASDF Version Manager, which also supports other languages too. So managing versions is a headache if I wanted to manage it locally. And I've tried that. I was doing that for a while with the Gatsby blogs, where I would switch between Node 18 and Node 20. And have to remember to do the Node triggers to change them because, well, which project was this again and which version do I need? Dev containers. I have my dev container with the project. It already has the versions that are for that project. I don't have to go, wait, which project is this again? Which versions do I need? Oh, I need to do what again to trigger my management? And C# isn't any better, just to be clear. So Node has its version managers and remembering to switch. C#, you have global JSON. That global JSON could be at the project level. or the solution level, or machine level. Global JSON could appear at various levels. And the default policy is to use the latest installed version. Well, if you've got a .NET Framework version or .NET 6, but you have maybe somebody else is on .NET 8 or .NET 9, those don't always play nicely together. And so dealing with the changes in that. So global.json would support that, but you gotta remember to do that. You can override the versions anywhere in that file hierarchy with global.json. So, hello dev journey. Alright, so managing versions with Node, managing versions with C#, you can already see that I'm just like, oh, at the end of the day, managing the different versions of the different tooling for the different clients and the different projects, and sometimes different projects for the same client with different versions, it's a headache. And I know I'm not the only one who's dealing with it either. And this is where I'm like, it has to be a better way to do things. There's got to be something. And sure enough, that's where dev containers come in mind. And so, what are dev containers? So with dev containers, yeah, you're going to see a lot of C container references here today, because this is usually how I think of everything. But with dev containers, you're containerizing your development environment. So you're putting your developer tools, all the things that you need. You can have the extensions. I'll show you how that works. But it's all containerized so that when you go and open up that project, you can open up the project with your dev tooling. So the development container will contain the tools itself. And then the environment can have multiple containers, sometimes with a sidecar as well. I think a sidecar container is things like DNS and doing some routing. I'm not going to have any demos of that today just due to timing. We want to make sure we have time to answer any questions as well. With dev containers, so they are supported with both Docker and Podman. Today's demos will be with Docker. Now, what goes in a dev container? So think of it as there's this JSON file, devcontainer.json. It is there for multiple types of orchestration. We'll talk about how you can build these containers. Devcontainer.json is a constant. So it uses what's known as JSON-C, so JSON with comments. You will see comments, I promise you. But we can capture the metadata for that environment at the image level or at the feature level or at various other levels. And we'll talk about what is metadata. Now this devcontainer.json file can live in multiple places. It could live in a .devcontainer folder. You may see it in some projects as .devcontainer.json. And some may even bury it in another folder deep. Now this is only one other layer, so it'd be like .devcontainer / some kind of folder name / devcontainer.json. Any deeper than that, it won't look. These are what it looks for in their documented paths. For me, you'll see my devcontainer.json in a .devcontainer folder, and that's just so that that .devcontainer folder hides things. Now, when it comes to metadata, what do I mean? So metadata could be any of these different fields. So you're going to see things like name, forward ports, app port, workspace mount and folder, container env, remote env, ports attributes, and other ports attributes. Like, what is going on here? Don't panic. The next few slides I'm going to talk about some of these different metadata pieces, what they mean, when you need to use them. And we also have a couple demos too. So first, let's talk about workspace variables. So your workspace, this is where you're writing the code. With the workspace, typically it's where your folder is for your project or your solution level. But we'll talk about, there's two different things to know about with workspace variables. So there's workspace mount, that's the mount point. So that's on my local machine, that's my source. It is going to be mounted some spot in the container. And then they have what they call the mount type. And that mount type matches what's in the Docker CLI mount flag. So there's volumes, and there's something else that's not coming to me off the top of my head, but that's what those are. So it's basically you have a folder locally, and you want to be able to access it in the container for your workspace, and so you got to tell it where it mounts. Now, if you have workspace mount, you also need workspace folder. Workspace folder is going to tell the container where your workspace is so that when you open up that container, it knows what path to open up to. So when we go to open up the projects, my projects right now are open locally, but I will show you how I open it in the container. Now when it comes to mounts, so there's, again, workspace mount that is specifically for the workspace itself. But if you have other drives, so maybe you have your projects live on another folder somewhere else, or you have, for example, database folders. So maybe you have a particular database, its MDF, LDF files for SQL Server, for example, live in a spot. SQLite file lives in a different folder, but they all happen to map to folders locally. That's where mounts come into play. Now I want to caution you when it's working with mounts and working with the workspace mount, we'll also deal with permissions. More on that here in a little bit. But these do map to the -- mount flag. Now one of the demos I'll show you is involving Node. Of course, there's a Node modules folder. If you haven't worked with Node.js, think of Node modules as that's where all of your dependencies are for all the packages that you rely on and their packages and so on. So Node modules, I have it locally, and then I also have it in a volume mount. And that's just so that I can work in my container and be able to clear my modules and reload them as needed. Okay, so then there's forward ports and app port. And if you're in the Docker space, these come into understanding when the ports get published and whether they're exposed within the containers or externally as well. Forward ports, this is port forwarding. This is your forwarding from the inside of the container to the local machine. So this is, in your syntax, you'll see like the dash, I think it's -p, and it's the host port to the source port. Then there's app port. Now app port's used for publishing ports locally when the container is running. And you need to be able to list out all interfaces, sometimes instead of just localhost to be external. So we'll show a demo with Gatsby where I do have to listen on all interfaces in order to deal with hot reloading. And then set both. So when developing locally and in remote environments, if you have to deal with both local development and then remote environments, be it in a dev container or something like code spaces, that's when you're going to probably need to set both. For most of my demos today, I'm using forward ports, and one I actually did refactor from app port to forward ports and it was working fine. So just be aware that typically you're going to lean on forward ports rather than app port. And the documentation for dev containers actually pushes you more toward forward ports as well. All right, let's talk about command hooks. So I guess before I get too carried away, any questions so far? Okay. If you have any questions, again, please post in chat. If you cannot post in chat, please subscribe. And then in 5 minutes after subscribing, then you can chat. All right, so next let's talk about command hooks. So command hooks, they allow us to run scripts at different points of the container initialization, creation, update, start, and attachment points. So think about it, that's the life cycle of your dev container. And it supports for serial execution with image-supported command line concatenators. So depending on your image that you're using, I use mostly Linux images. So the demos today will show Linux images. So you'll see the double ampersand for concatenating commands. So they run serially. But they also have the ability now to support parallel execution, and that looks something like this. So if you wanted to run both node start and starting up your MySQL database at the same time, in parallel, this would be what that looks like. Now the life cycle we're about to get into, so if you're going initialization to, wait, what? I got you. So first, the first of the command life cycle is the initialize command. So this is when you're working on building the container, initializing the container. This is run without a shell. This is run on the host machine during that container creation. And it can run more than once per session, depending on what happens with the container itself. the onCreate. So this happens without a shell inside the container immediately after that container has started and only for the first time. Now, as you're going through content, adding your content to your container, this update content command will get triggered. The update content command is whenever new content is available during the creation process, it will execute at least once. I don't have a good demo for this update content command, but just be aware that's what that is. Post create command I use often, and this is at the end of your container setup after the container has been assigned to the user for the first time. Do some things. Post start, I use that as well, and that runs every time the container is successfully started. So if the container is created and then started, so post create and then post start, if it gets stopped and then restarted again, post start command will execute again, but post create does not because it was already created once before. The only time post create is triggered again is on that first time that the container is created. Now if you get rid of the container and now you have to recreate it again, that's where post create happens because, well, that's the initial creation of the container. Post attached, so this runs every time a tool successfully attaches to a container. And then there's wait for. I don't use wait for, and that's just because I haven't had a need for it, but allows you to wait for any command. Typically it's update content command that you would wait for. So this is just another one to know in the command lifecycle. So we have the different parts in that process where we can inject our own scripts. What does this look like? We're getting there. I've got some demos here we'll show you. But before we can get into the demos, there are 3 different types of orchestration, and I have demos for 2 of the 3. And we'll talk about those as to why. So we have image-based, Dockerfile-based, and Docker Compose. So first things first, let's start at image-based orchestration. So image-based orchestration, if you go to GitHub, there's a dev containers images repo with all the different images that Microsoft maintains for dev containers. Now I mentioned Microsoft because if you go to containers.dev, which is the official website for dev containers, you'll see Microsoft on there. I need to stress though, just because we're pointing at Microsoft images doesn't mean it's the only set of images out there. And I think I have a demo for that with one of my Python things. So now why would you go with an image-based dev container? Image-based dev containers I love because they're fairly simplistic. Because it's just the dev container.json file. You can rely on just a pre-built image. You don't have any special configurations that need to be set in a Docker file. You don't have any special permissions that need to be set with the Docker file. If you don't have multiple containers, and if you just want a minimal setup and quick start configuration, then this is where the image-based dev containers come into play. Now with image-based configuration, it does require an image that can be reached with Docker pull. Most documentation out there you'll see was at mcr.microsoft.com for the Microsoft Container Registry. But as long as you can do a Docker pull, that means images on Docker Hub are just as accessible as, oh, you got those. The only required parameter in your dev container.json file is image. And you just tell it the image name. There is other metadata and it is optional. Now, what does this look like? So this here is my dev container for image-based orchestration. This is what we call so at my house, we have a bunch of WeMos, which are, think of it as the ability to toggle a power, so a plug, just through Internet of Things. Well, these WeMo devices are no longer supported, but we have to use Python in order to provision them. And so I had to create a Python script to deal with this. And my husband was just like, how does this all work? I'm like, I got this. So we're using an image Python. Now this is a specific version of Python that is supported. And then you can see that I'm installing the PyWeMo, and then I'm doing an apt-get update to install ping. The reason why I do that is so that I can ping the device on the network to make sure that we're getting a response. I have to do the -- network equals host as part of my run arguments. So run args is something else you'll see in devcontainer.json. These are the arguments that you would use when you're running a Docker command, the Docker runs, because I need to access the network of the host device in order to see the WeMo. Now let me show you what this actually looks like in Visual Studio Code. So I'm using Visual Studio Code with the remote containers extension. So if I pull up that one, and I will bring it over to the screen so you can see it. Now this particular, I'm going to close that prompt a minute. So this particular project, I have a couple Python scripts, I have a README, and I have my dev container JSON. Now my dev container JSON, some things I want to point out. So the name is the name of my dev container. I have the image, so this is the base image that I'm starting with. Again, if you can do a Docker pull on the image name, it's fine. Now there are other things here. So this particular dev container JSON I have here has lots of comments for just getting started. And so you can do things like features, which we'll show later, forward ports, which we'll show later. Now what I have in the post create command is once this container is created, then I want you to install the module for the WeMos, update apt, so that I can then get ping. Because again, like I said, I use ping in order to talk to the WeMo to make sure that it's responding. And then if there's any customizations, remote user we'll talk about here in another demo, and then there's the network host. Now I'm running locally, and the way you can tell is if I bring up my terminal. My terminal here, notice those are Windows paths. Now I did mention that I am running Visual Studio Code with the extension, so if I do Control-Shift-P, I have an option to do dev containers, rebuild, and reopen in container. Now, before I do that, I need to make sure Docker Desktop is running. This is something I commonly run into with dev containers, where you go to run the dev container, and the Docker engine isn't up. And so we've got my Docker engine running, and so I'm going to go ahead and tell it to rebuild. And so you can see it's connecting to the dev container. Whenever it's running those different commands, I'm going to scroll up while it's doing its thing. You'll see here running the post create command from devcontainer.json. So it's good about calling out which commands it's running. So you can see it's going to install the PyWeMo stuff. And then, of course, it tells me press any key to close the terminal. So I'm going to press any key to close the terminal. It doesn't look like anything concerning there. Notice now my terminal, there's a root, there's my Docker desktop. So the dev container, I am working now in the same folder space, but now I'm working within the dev container. Now how do I know that I'm working in this same folder area? Is because my folder list here, my Explorer, still has all the files I was working with. Now, again, there was no reference to the scripts here. Those scripts are taken care of. So if I do a ls, just so you can see, those are already copied over. I didn't have to write anything special for that. The dev container handles a lot of that as part of its build. Alright, so that's the Python demo. Oh, and just to be sure, so if I do Python -- version, you can see that works there. Now if I were to end that, so Control-Shift-P and reopen folder locally. If I go to Python -- version locally, it's a different version. So I don't have the same version, and that's okay. I don't need to have the same version because I have a dev container to take care of that for me. All right. Another example of image-based orchestration. So this is, let's say you're doing node development and you're dealing with node 20. Forward ports, 8,000. So a lot of different templates and packages and frameworks that you deal with node happen to expose 8,000 and 9,000. And so forward ports, that's where you put that there. And then here, this is what I have for mounting my local workspace. Now that $, let me grab my laser pointer here. This $local workspace folder, this is a supported variable that's part of the dev container site. As part of the thank you email, you'll have a list of links, and in those links I do point out things like the variables and the features and some of the other things we're about to go look at. So this here will take care of whatever your local workspace folder is. Now, Dockerfile-based orchestration. So what's going on with Docker files? Well, it starts with a Docker file. In your dev-container.json, you'll need to make sure that it's called out, but that image again must be reachable during Docker build. Your required metadata is build.dockerfile. That points it to the Docker file that you're working with. But there are other pieces that you have access to, so you can set like build context, build args, build target, build caching. I do use a bunch of Dockerfile based containers, so we'll take a look at those here in a little bit, but let's show Docker Compose based as well. So Docker Compose based dev containers support both V1 and V2 of Docker Compose. And this is used when you have multiple containers. So when you're dealing with, maybe you have your base language and then your database is a separate container. That's a good case for doing something like a Docker Compose, if you can't get away with that in a single image. Docker Compose does have some required parameters. So the Docker Compose file, you have to point it at your Docker Compose. Typically I'll have docker-compose.yaml within my .dev container folder. And then there's service, so you have to tell it what the main container is to watch for. Because just keep in mind, your Docker Compose has multiple containers. Each of those containers, so I usually call dev and then data. And so then my service is going to be dev, which is where my main workspace is. And then run services are the set of services that should either be started or stopped. Now, I haven't had to deal with run services as much, but I do have to have Docker Compose file, and I do have to have service. And in Visual Studio Code, it also is asking about the workspace folder. So your tooling is going to depend on which is going to, first of all, the tooling depends on what you have installed. I use Visual Studio Code primarily because multiple languages. Visual Studio has some support as well, as do the other IDEs, and that's all on the dev container site too. But I know with Visual Studio Code, I also had to set the workspace folder for Docker Compose. So, okay. A few more demos to go through on this. Always have to make sure your containers are running. There have been many times where I've gone, opened up the project, said, yeah, go ahead and start my dev container. And it's like, well, go make sure Docker's running. Okay. So, now I'm going to show a Dockerfile demo. This one I blog about in our NimblePros blog, and it talks about our Gatsby blog platform that we use, and we use it on a non-root user for the particular demo. And that's to show because some places require a non-root user. So I went through the process of, okay, what does it take for a non-root user? We are running Gatsby in a dev container, again, because I don't want to install Node.js on my machine with a bunch of versions and remembering which version manager I'm using, let alone which version I'm using. That gets to be a lot of cognitive overhead that I don't need. Dev containers removes that friction. With the Gatsby in a dev container, the Gatsby CLI is not part of the node images. So we need to install that. For this particular site, we also use Playwright to help generate our mermaid images. Mermaid images, think of them like state machines, flowcharts, different types of diagrams. That's where mermaid comes in. But we use Playwright, which means I have to be able to install that, which means I need to be able to have rights to install, which means I need to have rights to install in a Linux environment, which means I need to have super user access or sudo, however you pronounce it. So notice as I'm going through this, okay, now I need to make sure I account for all of these. And oh yeah, by the way, non-root user, by default these dev containers are running as root users. So if you're doing a non-root user approach, you need to remember to grant permissions to these folders. Because when you go to rebuild your site and you don't have access to node modules, that gets to be a pain. I've walked these pains for you, so let's show you what I found. So this is my devcontainer.json. Now, some things to note. So laser pointer. So I've got my name. I've got my Docker file. So if you remember a couple slides back, we mentioned about how you have to have a build.docker file. It says build. .docker file, it means Docker file is within build. And point it at your Docker file. I actually have a file in the folder at that time called Dockerfile. It was within the .dev container folder. And I am forwarding both 8,000 and 9,000. 8,000 for Gatsby develop, 9,000 for Gatsby serve if I choose to go that route. I have my two workspace ones, so I have that workspace mount. That's my local folder. I want it to mount to /workspace. This is a bind mount. Workspace folder is typically going to match your target when you're doing the workspace mount workspace folder approach. Now keep in mind this demo is specifically for non-root users because sometimes company policies require something like this. So that's when the remote user comes into play. You give your remote user a name, and I'll show you in the Docker file how this gets used. You're going to see parts on this slide and on the next slide that are bolded. They may appear red. I will also use my laser pointer to point these out. These are specifically for the non-root users. Now mounts, this one here, I also had to mount my node modules, and I had to make sure I had the right permissions on there. Because typically, I want to share the node modules. I'm fine with that. I don't want to have to keep pulling the things over and over. So, run arguments. So again, giving my environment a name. I always do that because I usually have a lot of containers in action. I have a post create and a post start. Now my post create, so remember this is when this dev container is created, what do I need to do? Well, you're seeing a lot of sudo or sudo plus commands, which means that I need to have elevated privileges in order to do these things. The sudo own, so I'm changing the ownership of my node modules so that my node user can access node modules. And then I need to be able to install my legacy with legacy pure deps for this particular project. And then playwright install dependencies. And then on post start, we're doing the playwright install and Gatsby develop --host 0.0.0.0. Now, if you're doing Gatsby, this part is important, the --host 0.0.0.0, because you need to be able to see this. If you're running this from your host machine, you need to be able to go, okay, I want to go to port 8,000. And then as you're making changes and do hot reload, you need to be able to have that exposed properly. So that's what's going on in this file, which is devcontainer.json. Now let's take a look at the other part of this. So remember, this is Dockerfile based. So we have a Docker file. So this is our Docker file. And you can see that it's node 20. But the key things that are bolded are things like I have to install the permission, or I have to install sudo or sudo. That's not included in the base image. And then I have to make sure that they have the ability to use the command. Now, that said, the Gatsby tools can be moved to the post create command in devcontainer.json. It just happened to be where I was at the time. And the environment variables. So the chokedar used polling and internal status port are used for hot reload. So let's say I'm editing my pages, then I want to make sure that it edits nicely. That's what I have to do for Gatsby. And these are covered in the blog post that I did. But for today's presentation, I was like, what if we just want to use the root user? What does that look like? Well, we're about to do this. So what if we can use the root user? That means we get to say goodbye to the Docker file. So now we're just down to devcontainer.json. So what did I end up changing? Well, we changed, instead of using a Docker file, so we don't need to do build.dockerfile, now we just have image. There's my base image that I was using that was called out in the Docker file. So that moves into here. And as I pointed out, the environment variables, those can go into the containers environment variables, or container env. And notice this is JSON-C, so I have comments in there specifically for why we have these environment variables present. And then you'll see that I moved some things in here. So we install the Gatsby CLI now as part of post create. And we call the Gatsby develop command things as part of post start command. So everything got moved from the Docker file into devcontainer.json. So that simplified it for us. So what does that look like? So that is this one here. I'm going to bring it onto that screen. So this particular container is for our website called deviq. Deviq.com is a reference site that we maintain. And so there's the image. Again, you can see in my terminal down here that we're in Windows. But I could do my Control-Shift-P, rebuild and open in container. Now, I guess the main thing I want to point out is this container env and the use polling and the hot reload. For a while there, it wasn't working. You could load the site, the ports were forwarding, but hot reload itself wasn't working. So it took a little bit of magic search engine things to make that happen. So if I go ahead and tell it to flip over, what's nice is you can tell it to see what it's doing. And a lot of these I already ran yesterday, the fresh builds, so that we wouldn't be wasting time on all of the builds that it takes. So you can see here, there's the npm install. And we'll install Playwright. So yeah, dev containers have made it a lot easier for maintaining things like Gatsby blogs, 2 different versions of Node, client work, C# and various versions of .NET. It's nice to just be able to keep that dev container folder with the dev container JSON and maybe the Docker files and Docker Compose files all with the solution, because now it's all together. This makes it easy too for onboarding new devs, because your new devs don't have to spend a whole day or two installing tools and making sure you have all the right extensions and stuff. You can have that all in your dev container. So you're like, hey, welcome to the project. By the way, we have a dev container. They start the dev container and away they go. So onboarding new people without having to worry about them setting up their dev environment because it's already set makes a world of difference. Okay, while that is running, we'll come back to it because I do want to show that. Now, what about a Docker Compose based dev container? So I don't have the demo working because I wanted to show this with eShop on Web, but our eShop on Web project has gotten a little more complex, and so rather than run into issues, we'll talk about it. So Docker Compose dev containers are good when you have to deal with an actual database. And when I say actual database, I'm thinking like SQL Server or Postgres or MySQL, something like that. You can put those in a container, and then have your development environment for whatever language you're working in as the main container, or what they call the service for the Docker Compose fields in devcontainer.json. That's the primary use for Docker Compose dev containers that I've had to deal with. But think of it also like maybe you've got to run tests. And so I've included these links. They'll be in the thank you email as well. But if you're doing a test runner and need to talk to a SQL Server database. And I can't stress this enough. Don't use the in-memory implementation of EF Core. And the reason why I say that is if you go to this document for the EF Core in-memory database provider, the official Microsoft documentation, it has so many different warnings and messages like, we're not updating this and you should not use this in production, and it has its very limited use case. I've run into nothing but issues with that, so don't do that. Use a real database. And we'll talk about how to use those in these posts. But just so you're aware, when it comes to Docker Compose dev containers, take advantage of it for a real database, especially nowadays. If you take a look at the licensing that's out there, you have SQL Server on Linux. You've got a developer SKU, which means that you can develop these things. Bigger companies, just watch out for licensing rules. But the fact that we can containerize these environments in their development and we don't have to spend millions of dollars on bigger enterprise systems necessarily. Just work with a container. The development life has gotten a lot easier. All right, before we get into that, this container finish? Oh no. All right, well then we'll just go on. So extensions. Extensions are another part that you can have in your devcontainer.json file. What this allows you to do is this allows you to specify what other extensions people should have installed. This is Visual Studio Code specific. Now, the extension that you see here, this is called remote containers. It is called dev containers. But when we refer to extensions in devcontainer.json, we're referring to this identifier over here. So when you hear things like MSVS code remote.remote containers, that's what we're looking at. But this dev containers extension is what we need for dev container tooling. Now, in our devcontainer.json, the extensions list can be customized to whatever you want it to be. Again, the identifier field. Now, we use this in eShop on Web. So if you haven't heard about eShop on Web, it is a long-maintained application. It's a reference application that displays different features. This was once Microsoft maintained. Microsoft has given blessings to Nimble Pros to maintain it, so now we have eShop on Web in our GitHub repo. And so you'll see I use that in today's demos. And the thing I want to call out, so there's the name, there's the image. If you see this mcr.microsoft.com, that's the Microsoft Container Registry. That's where a lot of the dev container based images live. They recently updated it to .NET 9, that came out in November. But then there's this customization section, and then VS Code, and then the extensions. This is where I was talking about those identifiers. And so making sure you have the different identifiers for the extensions. What's nice about this, again, goes back to the whole having a brand new developer coming onto a project. How many times you have to go into a new project? Okay, what IDE are you using and what extensions does everybody have installed? It's right here. This is all in your devcontainer.json file. And so you already have, these are the extensions we use. Install them and away you go. And of course I have port forwarding for this particular demo. Now, our Gatsby one is done running. So I can show you that one. So if I open another browser, and localhost 8000, and we'll bring it over there so you can see it. So notice as I hit localhost 8000, you can see my terminal. Now you can see I'm in the workspace, I'm in a dev container, because that's what it shows here in the Explorer. If I expand the Explorer, you can see it a little bit more. So that's the name. And I am going to go into testing, because that was one I like to test with. So bringing that over. So again, our website is deviq.com, but this is running it locally in our dev container. So I go to testing, and I'm going to go into our testing overview. I'm going to say we post about automated tests and save it. Notice when I save it, it triggers some changes here. Not pressing F5 at all. And so when I come into the browser again, notice there's a we post about automated tests. I'll zoom in so you can see that. Oops, right there. And then if I go back into my container and say, take that out and save it, it's doing its things. And I'm going to flip back to our deviq browser, and notice it disappears. So that's hot reload with Gatsby in a dev container. All right, let's go back to our slides. Okay. So with our things, the other one was eShop on Web. Actually, we do want to show eShop on Web. And with eShop on web, what I wanted to show you, open that in devcontainer.json. So eShop on web, notice here that it's asking me, do I want to install the recommended extensions? That's coming from this list here, this customizations, VS Code, extensions, and the various extensions. Now I could say show recommendations, and watch what happens when I do that. Notice it opens the tabs for each one of the recommended extensions. Those recommended extensions, again, came from our dev container, which is, I'm going to close some of these, which is, again, here in our dev container JSON. And dev container JSON. And again, you know I'm not in there. If I bring up my terminal, there's my Windows path. If I do Control-Shift-P and rebuild and reopen in container, then it'll go ahead and do that. So the beauty of dev containers, imagine having that development environment already set up for you, extensions already called out for you. Makes it easy to onboard people to projects, which is fantastic. All right, so we looked at extensions. Now let's look at features. And I have features in quotes. The reason why I have features in quotes is because that's the term that they use. So I'm not talking about the features of a language or the features of a product. I'm talking about a feature that's actually called feature. It's not confusing at all in our development life. So just so you're aware, the terminology that they're using, these are installable scripts. These are called out in your devcontainer.json file. They're self-contained, they're shareable installers. They're installable on top of any base image except where noted. All my demos today are Linux containers. I've been a Linux girl for a long time in terms of containers, and I worked with Linux back in the late 90s, early 2000s. So for me, Linux is something I'm very comfortable with. There are Windows images out there as well. Little caveat on that is if you are running Windows images on Docker Desktop, you cannot do both Windows and Linux running at the same time. Or if you can, I have not been able to find it. I've always had it trigger like, you can either see these or you can see the other ones. These features, for the most part, will work on any base image, except when they say that these require Linux. So, and maybe even distro specific. All right, so we're going to show a demo of features. Now, the way I have it is we're going to look at eShop on web. Now, the eShop on web devcontainer.json does not contain this currently during this recording, but I did mention to them yesterday that heads up I am showing this because it is such a nice feature to have. So if we go back to my eShop on web container, which is over here, and I go back to my terminal. Oh, I clear all of that. Okay. Now, working in the command line, maybe something I want to do is do some GitHub stuff. So I might have something like a GH, like GH pull. Notice GH is not found. Well, maybe I like my GitHub CLI and want those GH commands. Well, do I need to go into my dev container JSON? I don't have a Docker file here. I'd rather not have to go through the Docker file and then do like an apt install for any of this. It seems like it's a bit much. Well, that's because it is. I'm going to collapse my customizations. We're going to add a section in here for features. Now, the thank you email will include a link to the available features. I want to warn you though, the available features does show a bunch of features in the version. I don't know what that version is that it's actually pointing at. Some of the older versions are they're older. So like the GitHub CLI, it was like 1.0.13 or something like that. When the actual current version is in the 2 dots, almost the 3 dots. So I want to add my GitHub CLI. So when you add features, think of it like a dictionary. So you have the feature name, which in this one is dev containers. So they all start with your, and notice as I'm typing, it's making suggestions. And we are specifically looking for features. And there's the GitHub CLI. And then I don't have any options, so I'm just going to tell it like that. And fix my quotes. There we go. Now notice, as soon as I save it, that it's like, hey, this might need to be rebuilt. Fine, rebuild it. Again, eShop on web, running the .NET 9 container. So it's going to do its thing. We'll show the logs. So it's pretty quick. Remember, I showed you GH and how the command wasn't there. Yes, I know the Git repository is potentially unsafe. I do get that, and that's fine. And so then I'm going to go, say that's fine, that's fine. Menu terminal. So if I look at that and do a GH, notice now I get the help stuff. You saw how simple it was for me to add that feature. Now what's nice too then is I can come in here and say, you know what, maybe I want to deploy this to Azure, which means I like my Azure CLI. So I'm going to do some copy paste to make it easier on the typing. But then instead of this is Azure CLI. I'll take the trailing comma there until it rebuild, and it'll do the same thing. So then I'll have the AZ command line. All I have to do is add the feature. That's what these features are. These little installable scripts. I don't have to go into a Docker file and I have to do like an app update or app upgrade or whatever it is and then install things. No, it doesn't have to be that complicated. Features make that easier for us. Again, eShop on web, showing the GitHub CLI, Azure CLI, there's AWS CLI. There are a lot of features available. So in that thank you email, go to the features link, and that'll give you a good idea of what's available, different languages, different tools. Now, dev containers, you have to realize how many of us as devs are like, works on my machine. It's such a lame line. But nowadays we can say works on my machine and ship it because it's containerized. Think of dev containers as this is the answer to how do we get people into our project quickly, seamlessly, less friction, without having to tell them what is the list of tools that we install. That's all taken care of. You don't want to have all these different tools with different versions running on your machine because trying to keep them all separated and remembering which version manager to trigger that gets to be chaotic. Dev containers solves a lot of those problems. Do you have any questions? If you're here during the live recording, feel free to post in chat. Again, we run a subscribers only chat. And then if you're watching this on the recording, feel free to reach out to me as well. I've got a contact slide here shortly. If you need to reach out to us anyway, whether it's questions about any of our webinars or need help implementing things like clean architecture or domain-driven design, if you're dealing with migrating an application from an older version of .NET to .NET 8 or .NET 9, we can help with those things. If you're working with technical and non-technical teams that have a hard time talking with each other, bring us in. I will gladly help with event storming and things like that. So there are questions of, do you know if there are any plans to get a version of Visual Studio to use dev containers? So let me show you that. So we're going to go to the containers.dev site because that's where I live on this. And then you come under supporting tools. So there's VS Code. There is some Visual Studio support as of 2022. So Stephen, this is probably what you're looking at here. So if you go to containers.dev/supporting, let me post that in the link. At support dev containers. Supporting. So there is some support for Visual Studio. IntelliJ, so any Java folks, know that there is early support for dev containers. Those who use Rider, so IntelliJ is by JetBrains, Rider is one of theirs as well, that's their C# one. The tooling isn't called out here, but I would say with JetBrains, if it's in one of their IDEs, it's usually not far behind in the others. So if it's in IntelliJ, I would say keep an eye out for things like Rider and PyCharm and WebStorm as well. They're really good about keeping their tools updated with modern technologies. So this will tell you where things are at. Stephen, I'm also going to include a link to the Visual Studio documentation on dev containers. That way we have that in the thank you email as well. Because I know many of us who deal with .NET and the solutions, we're dealing with larger solutions, and Visual Studio Code only gets us so far. So. Anything else? Awesome. Awesome. I was really excited with the dev containers when I saw it late in 2023. It was November 2023 when I saw them, and I'm like, this is going to make my life easier. And here we are at the end of 2024, and I can tell you if you had told me that this year was going to involve things like Ruby again, I would have been like, what? Dealing with Java? What? But dev containers takes away a lot of those headaches that I've had working with them in the past. And again, that Gatsby issue where I have to deal with multiple Gatsby projects, this has solved a lot of those pains. All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in. And like I said, if you want the thank you email with all the supporting links for this, please sign up. Those who already signed up for today's presentation, you will get that email here shortly. For those who are just tuning in after the live stream, if you select that link, that should appear in your emails probably a few minutes after you sign up. So thank you for tuning in and have a great day.